The house greeted me, not with silence but with an unholy hum, the kind that lingers in electrical wires and old refrigerators, a tremor rather than a sound. I didn't knock, I still had a key, though it bent slightly in the lock like it didn't want to remember. It was late summer, the kind of oppressive humidity that makes wallpaper sweat and floorboards swell with memory. Every surface had a sheen, not of polish but of grease, as if time itself had dripped down the walls and hardened. The place smelled of spoiled ambition, and something sweeter, maraschino cherry maybe, rotting beneath the layers. The walls, once crimson with joy, were now faded to a bruised plum, dents tattooed the hallway, as if the house had tried to shake itself free of something that clung too tightly. The kitchen was the worst. Every cupboard yawned open, empty, drawers pulled out like tongues, mocking. The silverware was gone, every last piece. Not stolen, no signs of forced entry, just disappeared. It was symbolic in a way I didn't want to admit. My father used to say the measure of a home was in its silver, how it was set, how it was shined, how it was held in a guest's hand. Now there was only the ghost of metal. The fridge whined when I opened it. Inside, an opera of decay, platters of food arranged like altars, steak tartare, lamb shanks, poached pears, each fossilized mid-bite, bottles of wine unopened, some still bearing tags from French vineyards. Everything sealed and untouched, like offerings never claimed. He had died 2 weeks ago, alone, slumped over in the sunroom with a glass of nothing and a mouthful of everything. As I moved through the house, each room unfolded like a chapter in a cookbook rewritten by madness. Dining chairs stacked to the ceiling, candlesticks melted into the table. The pantry was a reliquary, cans from the 1980s, spice jars with labels faded to hieroglyphics. There was no order, only accumulation. And in the back of the linen closet, tucked behind sheets still in their plastic wrapping, I found them, letters, dozens, each addressed to me, none sent, some dated years back, others just months ago, one for each birthday he'd missed, each phone call not returned, each apology he couldn't frame in person. He wrote like he cooked, lavish, over-seasoned, almost performative, but underneath, raw. One read, "To my boy, do you remember the duck à l'orange we made in '97? You must have been 8. I still have the sauce-stained apron. I wore it last week, though there was no one to feed." I folded that one into my pocket. That night, I slept on the floor of the empty dining room, wrapped in a tablecloth. Through the cracked ceiling, a single beam of moonlight struck the center of the room, like a spotlight on absence. I kept thinking of his menus, how he'd always offered 10-course meals when no one was hungry, how he never learned to scale the portions of affection. I don't know when I started crying, only that it wasn't dramatic. It came quietly, like the leaking of a forgotten pipe, steady and slow. It wasn't mourning exactly, it was hunger, the kind that doesn't live in the stomach. What's the use of a feast, I thought, when no one's left to taste it? Morning leaked in sideways through the dusty slats of the blinds, spilling uneven gold across the parquet floor. I woke to the weight of the tablecloth, still draped over me like a second skin. My neck ached from the hardness of the floor. Somewhere, a pipe groaned. I made coffee, out of habit more than need. There was still some in the cupboard, vacuum sealed, unopened, unnervingly recent. He must have planned to have someone over, or maybe he just liked the idea of being ready. I brewed it with shaking hands, the bitter smell filling the house like the ghost of conversation. By noon, I was in the garage. It had always been his sanctum, less a workshop than a temple to acquisition. Dozens of unopened boxes stacked like bricks in a mausoleum, knives from Tokyo, copper pans from Lyon, artisanal salts from places I'd never heard of, still shrink-wrapped, still tagged, still waiting. I opened one labeled for Sunday. Inside were 2 crystal tumblers and a bottle of aged scotch. A note, to be opened when he comes home. I drank it, standing in the middle of the garage, the tumblers still pristine in their foam cradles. It burned going down. I didn't care. In the back, beneath an old tarpaulin that smelled of mildew and regret, was the rusted skeleton of the food truck he'd once dreamed of refurbishing, the Gilded Tongue. I remember the mock-ups he'd shown me, sleek black and gold with a menu that changed weekly. He never got it running. Just collected parts, spices, blueprints. He was always preparing, always waiting for an appetite that never arrived. I spent hours in there. The garage was less overwhelming than the house, more structured in its excess. Every hoard had a category, a theme. He'd catalogued the void. Among the culinary detritus, I found a faded Polaroid of the 2 of us. Me, maybe 6, sitting on the countertop, face smeared with chocolate. He's beside me, smiling in that half-shy, half-performative way. one arm behind my back, the other mid-whisk. I don't remember that moment, but I can feel it, like tasting something you forgot you loved. Back inside, I noticed things I hadn't before. A child's drawing taped behind the boiler room door, a post-it on the back of the spice rack. He likes cinnamon. A voicemail saved to the landline, my voice, young, asking if we could make pancakes again. He'd kept them all. Love, in his world, wasn't about presents. It was about curation, preservation, excess. He didn't know how to serve it hot, just store it for later, wrapped and labeled, waiting for a hunger he didn't know how to name. How do you forgive a man who tried to nourish you with everything but himself? The third day is always the heaviest. Not for any mystical reason, no resurrection, no symbolic completion, just that by the third day, the novelty of grief begins to rot like meat left out too long. The house felt heavier, not because more had been revealed, but because what remained was too stubborn to stay hidden. I stood again in the kitchen, though I'd sworn not to. The air had congealed, as if the humidity had turned sentient. Flies circled in solemn loops above the counter, guardians of the half-life lingering in spoiled gourmet. I didn't touch the food this time. Instead, I opened the drawer beneath the oven, the one he always said was broken. Inside, instead of rusted baking sheets, I found dozens of folded napkins, each embroidered with a date, a dish, and a name. Mine, mostly. Sept 4, 2003. Coquilles Saint-Jacques. For his first day of school. June 12, 2007. Duck confit. Graduation rehearsal. He'd made meals we never ate. He'd cooked for milestones I never celebrated with him, plating a version of our life where we were close, where food was communion and not substitution. And he had done it alone, again and again, the kitchen his confessional, the oven his altar. In the dining room, I began unrolling the tablecloths he'd hoarded. 20, maybe 30, still stiff with starch and folded like pressed regrets. Tucked in one near the hem was a receipt, a reservation for two, a date circled, my 21st birthday. I don't remember what I did that night. Probably something forgettable with people I barely speak to now, but he'd booked a table, at his own restaurant, for us. He hadn't shown up. I found the reservation book next, hidden in a crate of expired truffle oil. Names scribbled in dramatic loops, notes about wine preferences, anniversaries, allergies, but more often than not, scrawled in the margins, my name. Next to potential menu pairings, quotes from letters, even my old jokes, like sarcasm. Pair with something salty. Add extra bread. He always wanted more. What kind of hunger carves a man hollow like that? Later, as the light drained from the windows, I walked through the sunroom where he'd died. Nothing had been disturbed, not even the empty glass beside the chaise. The cushion still bore the dent of his body, like he'd melted into it. On the coffee table, a menu handwritten, water damaged at the edges, but legible. Tonight's tasting, for my son, 7 courses, each one tied to a year, a moment. The final dish read only, whatever he asks for, anything at all. It took everything in me not to laugh, not out of humor, but out of disbelief that someone could pour so much of himself into emptiness. Greed and gluttony aren't always about taking too much. Sometimes they're about giving too much, offering everything to a silence that never answers back. I wandered back into the garage that night, the scotch bottle now half empty, the tumblers less pristine. I sat on an unopened freezer chest, labeled Wagyu Dreams, and let the moths circle my head like tiny, aimless satellites. I thought of all the meals he'd never served, all the wine that had soured without a toast, all the words he'd stockpiled like preserves, waiting for the right moment. But love doesn't keep. Not really. It spoils when left untouched. How many of us are starving under the weight of someone else's feast? By the 4th evening, I couldn't tell if the smell of rot had faded, or if I had simply absorbed it into my clothes, my skin, my breath. The house was no longer a structure I moved through, but a second body I wore. Every creaking step felt like a joint giving out, a bone recalling old injuries. I began sorting the wine cellar, not out of necessity, but ritual. The labels curled like petals on ancient flowers, names faded into a drunken script. I arranged them by year, then by region, then by whim, each system collapsing under the weight of its own irrelevance. There were hundreds, maybe more, none opened, most never intended to be. At the back of the cellar was a framed article, water-stained and warped. The maestro of mouthfeel, a glowing review from a food magazine long out of print. My father's smile in the photo was radiant, his chef whites pristine. He was holding a spoon up to the camera like a communion wafer. I traced the glass with my finger and imagined smashing it, but didn't. Anger, like wine, needs air to breathe, and this house had enough of both. I sat on the steps, bottle in hand, and read the letters again. Not all of them, just the ones with grease-stained corners and messy handwriting. The ones he wrote late, when his control had slipped and the theatricality gave way to something messier. Human, one said. I kept feeding people so they wouldn't notice I was starving. But you always noticed. That scared me. I didn't cry. I couldn't. I had moved past mourning into something saltier, resentment perhaps, or truth. Grief is often just love with nowhere to go, but resentment, that's love turned inward, sharp-edged and half-swallowed. In a box marked personal, I found a collection of restaurant comment cards he'd saved. Most were glowing, a few critical, and then one, anonymous, written in a child's hand. The food is good, but he doesn't smile at me like he does at the customers. I don't remember writing it, but I know it was mine. I felt it in my gut like undercooked meat. Was that what I'd always been? A diner waiting for a different dish? A guest served last because I'd already been seated by blood? Upstairs, in his bedroom, I found the last feast. A 4-poster bed sagging with age. The mattress covered in throw pillows embroidered with French idioms and culinary puns. On the nightstand, a tray with cloche still in place. I lifted each one, half expecting decay, but found them clean, empty, just the silver domes, polished, waiting. A final performance never enacted. He'd set the table for a reconciliation that never came. In the closet, pressed between chef coats and formal jackets, hung a simple apron, the same one from the Polaroid. Its duck sauce stain now faded to a shadow. I held it against my chest, absurdly, like a child playing dress-up. The ties didn't quite reach. I wasn't as small as I'd been, nor as forgiving. But something in me softened then. Not a thaw, not quite, more a shift. The way a sauce reduces slowly, imperceptibly, until suddenly it coats the spoon. Maybe he'd loved me the only way he knew, through surplus, through spectacle, through the language of plating and portion. Maybe he had tried, and tried poorly. Maybe he thought preparing enough would eventually summon presence. But love is not mise en place. It can't be measured, cured, aged to perfection. It must be served warm and without pretense. I turned off the lights that night, not out of closure, but exhaustion. And as I lay in the hollow of his former room, the silence was finally honest, not empty, just full of everything unspoken. Is it enough to know we were loved, even if we never tasted it right? The final day began with rain, thin and persistent, not enough to soak, but enough to suggest the world was gently washing itself. I stood at the threshold of the house, holding the last box of letters, debating whether to burn them, bury them, or take them with me. Instead, I returned them to the linen closet. Not out of sentiment, but reverence. Some things, I realized, are meant to remain undelivered. Prayers, apologies, recipes for meals no one will ever eat. I walked the house one last time. The footprints in the dust had hardened into paths, like veins beneath tired skin. I traced them, not to clean, but to witness. There was nothing left to inherit. Not really. No wealth, no secrets. Just a long echo of overcooked generosity, unseasoned regret. In the parlor, I played an old record I'd found behind the wine fridge. A jazz vinyl, cracked and skipping, but warm. It played like he moved through life, with flair, with stumbles, with moments of aching beauty. I sat in the armchair across from the empty one, poured myself the last of the scotch and raised a toast. To the chef, I said aloud, voice steady, and to the boy who never got dessert first. I think for a second, the house sighed. The rain intensified as I packed the car. I took only what I could carry without aching. His apron, the Polaroid, the menu from the sunroom, everything else I left behind. The house, in all its cluttered failure, belonged to him, his cathedral of craving, his museum of missteps. I drove with the windows cracked, letting the rain thread itself into the fabric of the car, into the marrow of my thoughts. I didn't feel lighter. Grief isn't a weight that lifts. It shifts. It moves from the chest to the shoulders, to the hands, to the tongue. At a diner on the outskirts of town, I stopped for breakfast. Vinyl booths, black coffee, eggs too rubbery to forgive, but the waitress smiled like she meant it, and the pancakes arrived steaming. I ate slowly, without ceremony. Each bite simple, flawed, sufficient. At the register, I saw a father and son sitting across from each other. The boy was fiddling with syrup packets, the father scanning the menu like it held secrets. They weren't speaking, just being. The absence of effort felt holy. And for the first time in days, I didn't ache. On the drive home, I thought less about what he had left me, and more about what he'd never taken. My anger, my silence, my final word. He'd filled every space with too much of everything, and still managed to miss the one thing that would have been enough, himself. Somewhere along the highway, I realized I wasn't hungry anymore. Not for food, not for apology, not for the version of him I'd built out of leftovers and longing. Just full. In a quiet, uneven way. Like a table after guests have gone, crumbs still scattered, glasses half empty, but the laughter still echoing faintly in the walls. Maybe we all grow up at different tables, learning the wrong rules, mistaking abundance for affection, silence for seasoning. Maybe the feast isn't the food at all, but the invitation. And maybe, just maybe, it's not too late to set one of our own. What do we serve when the ones who taught us how to love forgot to teach us how to eat?